Hello and welcome to the Angelati studio at Charge 2016. We're now joined by Nick Gorgoglione, global brand builder, previously at Vodafone, and looking at global brands in general. So Nick, how are you doing today? How are you finding the show?
I'm good. It's good. It's been fun. It's great to be in Reykjavik.
Okay.
I've done a bit of snowmobiling previous to that, so it's good. And also, I think it's an important event, and it's the right time to do it. I mean, we've seen the rise of a number of key players, but also startups starting to look at energy in a new way, in a non-commoditized way. So I think now is the time to look at the branding, because so many companies have tried to launch products that on paper look very, very good, but then fall down when it goes to the consumer, and there's an expectation that a consumer behavior needs to change. And I think that's very, very difficult, despite however good the product is. So I think it's important, and I'd love to see the event grow, and I can't wait to come back next year.
Okay, let's crash into specifics here. And you've previously worked in the telco sector, and by all accounts, something that the utility sector holds, knowingly or unknowingly, as the benchmark of where to get to. So, in lieu of that, how are you finding some of the pain points, the opinions being given at the show? Are they kind of in line to where you were, like say 3 years ago at Vodafone, or what are you thinking?
I think it changes from provider to provider, from company to company. But in general, there's a lot of synergies. I mean, one of the things that telco had to its advantage was that it was a sector that came into the market quite late, whereas now, with energy, it's a sector that is trying to reinvent itself. So it's a bit different, right? So energy is a commodity, so it's trying to convince people that it's not a commodity, whereas telco is commoditizing. So it's going through a process of becoming a commodity, and that's where the two differ. But they both are engineering-led disciplines, and I think that's where the engineering comes, and that's where a lot of the pros and the challenges. So I think both sectors have a lot of innovation happening, and a lot of R&D, and a lot of cool things. But sometimes being engineering-led can be a bit difficult, because it's, within organizations, it's often not easy to have conversations around brand or around things that are supposedly a little bit fluffier to people who are quite analytical. Because I believe that brand is a mixture of A and, left side and right side of the brain, A and B type. And sometimes those sensitivities are a little bit difficult to convince an organization that they're worth pursuing. But yeah, I think the challenges are quite similar, and I do think energy has it a little bit more difficult than we do. I think it's a bit of a. I think we've had good glory days, whereas I think energy has. I'm not too sure how many glory days they've had. I think it's. Now that the sector is opening up, there's deregulation, the market there's more players, there's more options. The challenge is convincing people that they need those options, right? When all they want to do essentially is come into a room and switch on the light. And that's where the challenge comes in.
And it's very interesting you mentioned that, because I've kind of got a quick fire round of things here. In fact, normally I pretend like there's nothing on my card. Sometimes I'm just doodling. I actually do have a list of things here. And let's touch on that first point, in a sector or a service or an industry that's so commoditized. It's basically shifting electrons from A to B. In my case, I switch on the lights or I go to Netflix, but I probably plug in the TV, and that's my last engagement with my utility. So how would you actually drive differentiation in this sector? Do you maybe have some ideas on how this could pan out?
I think it's important to understand the insight. For example, if you want to go off the grid, right, and you want to promote, you've got a product that is a product that promotes going off the grid. The insight about that might not be the sort of the rational benefits to why that's a good thing, because ultimately people don't work on a rational basis. Your key insight might be, actually, the people that we're targeting are high net worth and they want something to talk about at dinner parties. And that turning it from something and really looking at those insights is often what can get you to a good marketing campaign or a good brand campaign, and can actually get you to engage with audiences and for them to listen. So I think it's really carefully looking at the insights that will take into differentiation, and not, because telco does this often, and not asking people what they want. People do not know what they want. It's asking leading questions and then deducing what they want from what they say. And I think that's the difficult thing. And I think people will get it, because the one thing and the one insight that the energy sector does have is that energy is cool if you present it in the right way. If you show people how things work and how how there are different options and how things are alternative, and how there are alternatives, more often than not, people will go, oh, actually, that's quite cool. That's actually something that, I'd listen to this. Instead, if you take and you approach the conversation with, I've got a new product, I've got a new way that you can turn on your light, you've already lost somebody. But if you sort of tease the conversation, perhaps just show them what it can do, show them a couple of benefits, and then get into a conversation about sales or about conversion, it's probably the right thing. So I think I think insights is probably the key word that I'd look at there, and proper behavioral customer insights, not asking people what they want.
Is it also a question as well around, like, say, context as well? Like, say something that happens very frequently in the telecom sector is, I get those ads from 3, and they don't really talk about how much 3G I'm getting. It's the last thing I get in the ad. What they talk about is travel and the holidays that is actually in my lifespan.
Yeah.
Is that sort of something similar that maybe the utility sector could maybe embrace, get involved in? More about energy in my lifestyle as opposed to the plug on my bill, which is an inevitability, right? I'll get billed.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think you have to be somewhat tactical, because ultimately you have to sell something, and internally you're never going to get around the sales teams, right? And especially in engineering-led companies, more often than not, the sales teams are the rulers of the roost. So you've got to keep them happy, and I think it's important. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that you can't have more long-term campaigns that really draw out the benefits of the product that you are proposing from a more emotional level. So I think it's about it's about knowing what you stand for as a company, having a single-minded purpose, and then carefully balancing long-term objectives and short-term objectives, because ultimately we all work in organizations, and and those organizations are complex, and a communications function within that organization needs to be sensitive to what that organization needs, and also be sensitive to what the customer needs. And it's about balancing those two things that will probably get you to the right point of success. I think the last thing a brand team can do going into an energy sector is going in with only higher order benefits, or only big brand campaigns that sort of pull on the heartstrings or that are emotionally led, because I think probably you're not going to have the ear of the CEO, and then that's not going to work. So I think balance is probably the right word, and then consistency.
And how key will that be to, say, getting internal buying for, say, either long-term or short-term campaign, or depending obviously on the company's focus?
Yeah. I think buy-in is difficult, and often companies need to fail a little bit to understand that branding is actually important, and to understand that branding is more than just a communications function. It's everything that your company does. It's organizing your company around a single purpose, around a common truth, a common capability. It's about awareness of yourself, about who you are as a company, where you can go, where you can't go. It's about where you're going to go in the future. It's about being specific, not indifferent, because I think that's probably the worst space that a company can be in, is if you ask a customer, what do you think? And they go, I don't really care. Then you know you have a problem, because that means that you're not anywhere. And it's difficult sometimes if especially companies that have some success in being very tactical, because then they go, oh, well, the previous model has worked for us. And often seeing things go wrong in the brand is an early indicator of long-term commercial deflation. So I think sometimes it's a case of being patient, actually letting it fail a little bit so that you have those proof points and going, actually, we didn't do this and this was the result. And then secondly, knowing what the agenda of a CEO is from a commercial perspective, and how you can cleverly add to that or aid in that commercial objective. And then you throw in the stuff that you want to do, right? You sort of sneak it in a little bit on the side. So you get buy-in on what they want, and then you go, okay, but the compromise is, I need to do this. And then you talk about and you do some internal PR about the benefits of what that is. And I think the most dangerous thing that I've seen fail is brand teams that only have long-term objectives. That doesn't work, because organizations are now incredibly impatient, and you've got to have quick wins under your belt, and that's how you've got to organize yourself. So I think it's about being smart.
Okay, staying on the practical side of things, on the B2C side, a lot of these companies, the power and utility companies, will tend to be, stuck within a region. But then on a B2B level, the suppliers, the solution providers for said space would largely be global, or will intend to be global at some space. So I guess there's a question here around centralizing brand activity, and when is it important to retain, the local roots or nuance or influences?
That's a difficult question, and I think all companies have dichotomies and have sort of things that they struggle with, and global versus central is always one of those themes. It's a hard one to answer without knowing what is specific. I actually think both can work. I think you can centralize very successfully, because often, especially when it comes to utilities or even telecommunications, often the needs of people are the same across the world. So you often don't need to run multiple campaigns. You might have to nuance them a little bit, but you can run a global agenda if you want to. At the same time, being hyper-local also works, right? I think what's dangerous is when a company says that they're global but then act local, or says that they're local and then act global. And that's organizationally important because your internal functions won't know how to react. So for example, if you say that you're global, then production of everything from strategy to communications to the coordination of your brand activity needs to happen at the center, and then your local teams are implementers of that central strategy. If it's local, then it's just the central team acts as a consultant and probably goes in when things go wrong, because they have a macro oversight into what's going on. So being absolutely clear as to what you are is more important than is probably more important than which way you go, because you could probably go either way. And it sort of depends on the legacy and capabilities of a particular company. If you have a history of being central and it's worked, and there's no reason to change, then I think consolidates even more. So it's a difficult one to answer. I think it's a case by case, but I think my takeaway is choose global or local, and make sure that organizationally you can deliver against that.
Okay, I guess that's fair enough. Let's touch on CSR.
Right.
Actually, I would have asked you about separating price and value conversations, but you've pretty much touched on that through this conversation. So let's fast forward to CSR, and it's one of those themes that comes up in terms of being a potential tactical aid for your brand perception. Is there a possibility of overdoing it?
Yes.
Is it
All the time. All the time. I think people overestimate. Look, CSR is great, but is it the trigger that's gonna drive consideration? Probably not. It might drive admiration, slight bit, but probably. And remember, I think both in telco and in energy, you often are coming from a point of skepticism. So doing CSR people can smell a rat, you know, even if you're well intended, even if there isn't a rat. So I think with CSR, I think it works well in B2B. I think that's where you can actually talk about CSR quite a bit. I think it works well in certifications, you know. So for example, you know, if you're ethically sourced and you can add a certificate that you're ethically sourced, I think that works very, very well. I think doing campaigns about starving children in parts of the world as your main brand campaign, probably not.
But let's look at one of the practical things here for the utility sector. And I guess in my view, the equivalent of that being ethically sourced would be green energy.
Yeah.
And that's a very dangerous thing because this could necessarily be all or some of how you produce energy. So how would you put that in the context of CSR, or is this?
I don't see that as CSR. I see it as part of a part of what a company does. Their DNA. To me, CSR is extracurricular activity. So foundation activity, sponsorship activity, philanthropic activity, all of that. And I think those things are quite useful in a networking perspective because there's a lot of networking to be done in that way. As I said again, it's B2B. I think it's if you want to heighten admiration for your company, if you want to disprove sort of some ill perceptions, I think then it works very, very well. But I'd be very careful not to overdo it. I have not seen evidence from a commercial perspective of it being a main driver of consideration.
So would you say it's almost in a weird way, then I know you're saying very clearly that green energy shouldn't really be considered as CSR.
No.
But then bearing in mind that if you are going to go down the route of say being green, be very, very clear that you're actually going to do it, because I imagine from a business perspective, right?
Yeah. But being green is a commercial driver. It's part of your USP, right?
Or should be, right?
Or should be. So I really don't see that as CSR at all.
Okay.
I think CSR, looking at it from a CSR's perspective, is if you, for example, donate to charities that promote green living. That's more CSR.
But don't see being a green company as your CSR.
Yeah, exactly.
No, God, no.
No.
Okay, let's finish off on the concept of sub-branding.
Yes.
And how that would apply to, when that's necessary in general, and how that could apply in the power and utilities context.
Right. So I have very strong feelings on sub-branding. So essentially, sub-branding can be very dangerous in the wrong hands because it can cannibalize your master brand, it can fragment your company, it can add organizational levels that are not necessary, costs can spiral out of control, or there can be an underestimation of what it takes to actually develop a sub-brand. You need a separate media budget, you need a separate legal team, you need a separate commercial team, you need to create another company. And often what companies will do is they'll create what I call sub-brands light. In other words, put a new logo on it, but not support it in any other way. And more often than not, those little brands fail. I think when you can sub-brand is when you're creating a product that's outside your core capabilities, right? That's completely different to what you do. Then sub-brand is good. When you're doing something quite risky and you think, oh, okay, it could actually impact the master brand if this goes wrong, so you can test it with a sub-brand, and then with the view that if it goes well, reincorporate it into your master brand. Or if there's a particular segment that is so tainted by your master brand, for example, youth is often one of those, then sometimes a sub-brand is justified. But even in those cases, I'd probably try to change the positioning of the master brand a little bit more. So my final thoughts, I think your starting position should always be master brand, or a product brand under the master brand, because I think that's how you build equity in one company, right? I think if you then have reasons for that not being possible, then you can start looking at a sub-brand, but be very, very careful as to what it actually means to develop a sub-brand and fund it properly, both from a human resources perspective and a budget perspective.
Okay, well, I think that's a brilliant place for us to bring this interview to a close. So thank you very much for these insights.
Pleasure.
And to you as well, thanks for tuning into this session as well. If you'd like to get a bit more insight into the inner working of actually developing branding strategies at local and global levels, please check out the rest of our interviews at the event, and please feel free to share the links with your colleagues. Thank you.